Joining us now, former Trump White House National Economic Council Chief Economist Joe Lavorgna. He's SMBC, he's laughing, Nikko Securities Chief Economist, and former Biden Treasury Department official Natasha Sarin. She is a professor at Yale, president of the Budget Lab. So I'll start with you, Joe. You could cut here. The only reason you wouldn't cut is because personal income and everything else is so strong.
Because if you look at Powell's favorite indicator, the
Supercore,
Supercore, which is services, they're running at 3%. It's down from where it was. It's come down 100 basis points. So a Powell-adjusted real funds rate hasn't moved from where it was last fall. Moreover, Joe, as you were talking about, the trade numbers are better. The tariffs revenue is upwards of $300 billion, and there's been no effect on the inflation numbers. It's all been absorbed in the margins, which is what yours truly and many others had argued could happen. And so far, it's played out great.
We talked about that earlier. You should say use the third person, say which Lavorgna was arguing. That's really sound. That's when you really get impressed with yourself.
Well, you were arguing with me as well when I was on.
Kernan was arguing.
Kernan
was arguing? Right. What was I
arguing? But I would argue that this is exactly what the administration laid out, and this is so far what is playing out in spades.
So I think the challenge with interpreting any one set of data in that way is that it's true that the inflation numbers are giving us a bit of a backward-looking indicator. We're talking about inflation in April. And you're starting, and in April, what was on store shelves is really stuff that was brought into the U.S. in a fundamentally different tariff regime than the one that we have today. And I think the numbers are also telling us that precisely these trade deficit numbers, that you are going to start to see some of these impacts over the course of the many weeks ahead, because the trade deficits are shrinking, presumably because the tariffs are working by whatever working precisely means for the administration. And so those impacts are going to show up down the road. That's why you're seeing Walmart tell you that they're going to have to raise prices. They know they're going to have to do that this summer because the cost of importing has gone up very significantly for them. The effective tariff rates in this country today are 21%. When Trump took office, they were 2.5%. So those are huge shifts. And by the way, they've been hugely volatile, right, Joe? They've gone up and down and up and down. Just this week, they were 7% 2 days ago, and now they're 21%.
I mean, is it a win that you said we know why it's happening? So that's what he's trying to do.
It's hard for me to understand exactly what the objective of this type of
so you don't know whether trade deficits matter. You don't know what.
Well, actually, I don't understand entirely why we have this view, and I don't think it actually is your view, Joe, that trade deficits are bad. Like, I run a trade deficit with Whole Foods because I go there and I buy groceries, and that's good for me. It's better than me having to go out and fend for food for myself. And so countries have comparative advantages. Importing is good. It allows us to exploit ours.
Right.
Exactly. And so I'm not entirely sure why looking at these trade deficit numbers and being like, oh, it's way down, is telling us something that's fundamentally good about the economy.
I want to say the market, the professional forecasters are looking for much higher inflation readings in March and April than what we got.
Right.
Because they were assuming the tariffs were going to be there. So this isn't a one-month phenomenon. David Ricardo's great. Everybody is taught comparative advantage is wonderful. But I want to be the country, and I've said this before, that makes the computer chip, not the potato chip. And it's clear from what Secretary Bessent has said and President Trump that national security and economic security are intertwined. And when we run a massive trade deficit with a pure competitor and a strategic adversary, there are serious national security and national emergency risks. And to the Biden administration's credit, they kept all the Trump tariffs and had voluntary restraints on technology. Trump and his foresight now is moving this further up the field. This should be a bipartisan issue. And unfortunately, it's just Trump bad and nobody's giving him any credit.
Joe, I think you're making a very good argument with respect to tariffs in particular areas, right? You're telling us a lot about tariffs with respect to China. It is hard to explain why that argument extends to a 10% across-the-board tariff with all of our allies.
Well, okay, yeah, I hear your point. The thing is, the European VAT is effectively like a tariff because the exporters.
It's not a tariff.
Let me finish. It is a tariff in the sense that the exporters get a credit when they offshore elsewhere, and tariffs are designed to raise money. So if you understand the Trump policy, it's very easy. Tariffs are a revenue source, a rebalancing source, and a reindustrialization source. They all work interconnectedly. I don't understand why people have such a hard time understanding that.
Well, just one particular point, and I'm curious for your reactions and others. Tariffs aren't like a VAT, because a VAT applies to if you're in France and you have French wine, or if you're in France and you have U.S. wine. So they're fundamentally different objects. One is
well, the
punishing.
French actually tariff California wine quite significantly.
Joe, but here's the thing that I don't understand. If the president wanted to come out and say, look, we need to raise revenue. We actually want a tax. We actually need a tax to raise revenue. And I think, meaning I'm now pretending I'm the president.
You're a third person.
I'm the third person. I think that the best way to raise revenue is to do it through tariffs, because I can put some of it on the American consumer and maybe hopefully some of it on the folks that are manufacturing or distributing the stuff. And that's how I'm doing it. That's one thing. If you were to frame it that way, maybe, by the way, there's certain people who could get behind that. Say that's some people say it's regressive. There's all sorts of things, but you could go that direction. But that's not exactly how it's being framed. And so then people are sort of taking it and twisting and this and that, right?
Yeah, but it depends who you ask, because if you look at the polling, most of which is bad. Rasmussen reported this week that the presidential's approval rating is the highest it was since he took office on January 20, and the country's moving in the right direction at its highest marker in 16 years. So I think it depends who you ask. And by the way, the people that are complaining about how the president is doing policy are the same people who never, ever argued, Andrew, there was a problem. So you talk about China and free trade and comparative advantage. Right. David Autor from MIT has talked about how you've had a hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing in the industrial base, which has decimated communities across the country. That's a real problem that none of the Ricardian free traders back in 2000 ever thought would happen. And a country doesn't exist if it's that bifurcated in terms of the haves and have-nots.
But maybe just one piece on revenue. I think Andrew's point is really important. We're debating a tax bill that's going to be like a $4 trillion increase in deficits. And the idea is that this tariff revenue, maybe one of the ideas is this tariff revenue is going to help us pay for that. The tariff revenue, current tariffs are going to raise something like $2.4 trillion over a decade. But the administration doesn't want tariffs to stay at this level, do they? They are saying they're doing all these deals. They're doing all this negotiating.
That I don't know. And I don't know, and I'd be curious on your work that you've done on the budget, what you're assuming. But one of the big problems I have with CBO is it assumes real GDP averaging 1.8 in the next 10 years. They have productivity averaging 1.4, which is stupidly low, and labor force participation barely growing at its slowest rate since the early 50s. If you have reasonable numbers, you are going to get a lot more revenues, and that's pure math. And I wish the CBO just had a more realistic forecast and not just a doom and gloom estimate.